Hello, Honors 410. We're at a point in the semester when we have a lot of different balls in the air, so I want to do a round of quick reminders and clarifications and all that. So, first of all, just a reminder we have our first group led discussion coming up in our next class. I will probably not be recording a video lecture for that one, but rather letting the group have the floor, and I might add some additional notes via text beneath the video. But regardless, I'm really looking forward to what the group does and welcome that group to reach out to me if they have questions. I've heard from a couple people in the group, and it sounds as though things are underway. So I'm excited to see what you all come up with. Also wanted to offer a reminder about reading response journals. Most of you are clearly really on top of this, are right on top of the reading, if not even a little bit ahead of where we are with the classes as I post them. A few folks are behind on that, but that's okay. You don't need to keep submitting journals all the time. It's largely up to kind of your work style. There are still a few folks who I haven't seen any journal work from yet. So as a reminder and clarification, again, I know this is kind of beating a dead horse for most folks, but in case you were still unclear on this, reading response journals are totally separate from these online class discussion threads. So if you've been getting nag messages from me in the past, if you just knew this was a responsibility you have intended to and you're fuzzy on what it's supposed to be, please feel free to shoot me a message individually. We can help clear up those questions, or even schedule a time for us to have a video chat or an audio chat to just more directly kind of address whatever questions you might have. I hate to see people fall behind, and I know in this online format it's easy for that to happen. So if you're feeling a little bit lost on some of how the class is working, particularly in that regard, feel free to check in with me. For the critical essay, a reminder that's due a week from today. Really encourage folks to get working on that if you haven't already started on it. If you want to send me some of a thesis statement or some general idea of what you're working on, if you're wanting feedback, I welcome you to send that to me in advance. No requirement on that though. So if you just kind of want to plow through if you're confident in your essay writing skills. I know a number of you I've worked with in the past and have done really nicely on essays for me before. So be confident in yourself. I'm very confident in you that you can pull this off. But if you are feeling uncertain, or if you want some feedback or have questions, feel free to message me individually, and we can sort those things out. I want to note in the syllabus it says to have a partial draft ready for next time. That's basically if we were going to meet in person, I would try to facilitate a peer review exercise around those. Most of my efforts at doing kind of peer review things in this remote format have not been particularly constructive, at least from my point of view. So I'm not going to mandate that. I'm not going to facilitate any formal activity around that. No partial draft actually required for next class. Nonetheless, I do encourage you to stay on top of it. If you can have a full draft written by middle of this week, you'll be in really good shape moving forward to not have this be a big thing that's looming going into the weekend, but rather just to be able to kind of coast on that aspect of it, take some time to really proofread things carefully, tinker, revise, and really put forth your best foot for this particular assignment. So we have our fourth set of flash fiction pieces being posted today. So I'm gonna leave those up there. People are doing a really good job of commenting on them in general. So again, I encourage you comment on each other's work, engage with each other too. If there's things that you really agree with, or you have kind of questions about based on something that someone else in the class says, by all means that can be part of the discussion. I've been trying to lean back from participating in the online discussion of those, mostly because I give more detailed notes each individual student privately of both pros and cons that I see in their pieces. But what will weigh in occasionally, and rest assured I am reading those and taking them into account. And again, you just for those of you who've already gone, I'm sure it felt pretty good to get some compliments from your peers in response to your work. And for those who haven't gone yet, I'm sure that's part of this that I hope students look forward to. And so you return the favor, help each other out. Please try to comment on at least one of the pieces from your peers as they go along. And if you have time and the ability, I encourage you to comment on all of them. Please make sure you're at least reading all of them, though, because that's a big part of this class, is just to expose each other to each other's work and see what you can get out of it. Because I have the assigned readings that I'm giving all of you, but I have my own conceptions of violence in literature, and obviously as the professor, I get disproportionate say in what we read and how the class operates. But this is really the chance for the class to take some ownership over itself, right? To present kind of your own ideas around violence in literature and have some fun with these creative projects. I hope folks have found some enjoyment. I know I've enjoyed reading them and engaging with a number of you about them behind the scenes. But okay, so moving on from that though, I want to keep this relatively short because I know I'm asking you to do some extra reading with the flash pieces and ask you to weigh in on those in the discussion. So we'll cut right ahead to education, which is the most recent piece I've asked you to read from The Longer We Were There. So for this one, I want to start on page 26 with sort of this middle paragraph here in the book here. So on page 26, it reads, "It felt strange, and I wanted to communicate that somehow I wanted to show people the strangeness, because they couldn't know just by looking. This wasn't my hometown, where people knew me, so I had to perform it. And since the bottoms of my feet were torn up from the long ruck marches, I took off my socks and began cutting away the dead skin, piling it on my desk, with the door open." And this is such a strange sort of moment, at least in my reading here of this. And I'm curious why we think more would include this sort of gross detail, right? If I were to publish an essay where I talk about taking out the bottom of my foot and kind of carving away dead skin, I don't expect very many of you would want to read that. I wouldn't want to write it, right? So why more would include this? There's a degree of vulnerability in the text here where he's kind of copying to something that he did. There's a sort of intimacy because it's the sort of thing that people do. Everyone does sort of weird things with kind of their own self-maintenance of their body and whatnot. But to share it in this format, that's sort of inviting you in, right? But what this does, how we read this scene, so on and so forth. And Moore raises this notion that, and this is just a little bit above that, actually sort of in the middle of that preceding paragraph, this idea that any problem that he encounters in civilian life should be easy relative to the ones at training. So this idea of comparing, again, civilian life to military life, this happens a lot throughout the book, but I think it's especially a focal point of this particular essay. How we read that, right, in terms of do we understand what he's saying? Because I think there's a way in which I might not fundamentally agree, but I can certainly wrap my head around why someone would say that the idea that anything happening in military life should be easy relative to military training. But what we make of it, and more so, I was just the more ultimately feels that rings false. So that's not really true. Why does that end up ringing false to Moore? And do we agree with his interpretation on that? The next place I want to go was skipping ahead a couple pages to page 30. The first full paragraph, just this little one, midway down the page. "Army instructors, like all instructors, sometimes have to help their students imagine situations in which the thing they're learning will be necessary in the real world. Ground fighting was one of those times." So with this, so there's a couple pieces I like about this short paragraph. There's a piece of sort of demystifying things, right? So to be transparent here, Moore spent some time teaching college level writing classes in addition to his military career. So he's speaking from experience on a few levels here of that he can see behind the curtain of when someone's teaching something, there's some aspect of how do I apply this to real life? How do I make sure students think this is actually important? And the way he words it suggests even an idea that maybe it's not that important. And maybe that sometimes teachers know that. I'll cop to it as someone who has taught for the better part of a decade now that there are times when I try to make connections for students to make them more engaged or more interested. In some cases, I'm very sincere and that's very much on the up and up. And in some cases, I know that I'm doing some manipulation here, right? Where I'm kind of making something sound more practical than it necessarily is, or grasping at straws to try to make something more accessible. And I'm not going to tell you when I'm doing it, when I'm not doing it, because that would ruin the illusion. But I think you could probably recognize this as college students. You've probably seen these dynamics at play at various points. So there's something about demystifying both the military and demystifying education and higher education in particular in the way that Moore frames this, and sort of making them all the same, which I think is a great skill of Moore's to make these experiences that are probably alien to a lot of his readers, but to make them relatable, to make them applicable in their world experience. There's sort of a meta quality to that too, right? That as the writer, he has sort of become the teacher, where he's relating stuff to us in a way that he hopes we'll be able to understand it. So I think that a lot of stuff is going on in that deceptively short paragraph there. Next place I wanted to go was to page 32 here. The last full paragraph that is captured on this page. So it reads, part of me didn't want to describe what we were doing. I knew the way it would sound, and yet part of me believed the training was serious and meaningful. The problem was inhabiting both parts, civilian and military, simultaneously. Each part always believed the other was absurd. I was always taking myself too serious and also not seriously enough. And both parts were always correct about the other because they had different rules. It was a matter of context. The military parts became absurd when exposed to a civilian context, the way blood changes color when exposed to oxygen. In a civilian context, it was absurd to have so persistently imagined and practiced these acts of violence. But more than violence, I'm talking about death. Part of the absurdity comes from this persistent imagining of death. I think this is a pretty profound paragraph here, right? But I think, again, I think a big heart of this piece is around what happens when we pair a civilian life with a military life, and more being part of the National Guard here. There's definitely he's immediately in that context of flipping the switch between the two, on a somewhat regular basis. But I think this happens to anyone who has a different parts of their life almost. And I'm probably overgeneralizing here, but for example, when I compare my life as a teacher to my life as a father, I think those are probably the two primary roles that I identify myself with now. Where there's parts where when I think of the amount of time spent trying to lull my son to sleep at night, right? And sort of fight him on that it's bedtime. That seems sort of absurd from a professional perspective, right? Where I'm someone with graduate degrees who gets paid to enlighten people about literature. That I'm spending / squandering so much time trying to sing, trying to wrangle this kid, trying to pick him up from playing with his blocks, and he's screaming and yelling and so on and so forth. Seems sort of absurd. But then on the other side, when I think of how much I value my family life, my role as a father, it can be absurd that the amount of time I spend answering emails from fellow faculty and from students and from administrators and all of that, where it's like, how does any of this matter, right? I should be focusing on my role in the family. So I think that this sort of code switching, right? Or this idea of kind of changing what we prioritize based on the context we're operating in that moment, I think is really relatable to all of us. But I think especially applicable in a context like Moore's. And I think it's a lot of interesting stuff to say in the latter part of that paragraph around violence, which again is sort of a touchstone throughout this course, obviously. So in any event, I'm interested if people have reactions to that specific paragraph there. Let's see. Cutting ahead, related to that, I might actually read this before. On page 38, the beginning of this paragraph here. I never fought on the ground in the dirt until a buddy arrived with a rifle, which isn't very surprising. What surprises me and confuses me is how there was never a civilian part at all, or a soldier part. I was never one, then the other. As citizen soldier implies, that phrase was like a teeter-totter, swinging up and down over its hyphen. It wasn't like that. To think it that way doesn't make any sense, hinging together these two mutually exclusive categories. So, I've already kind of talked a little bit about this, but just this idea where Moore describes, you might think there's a balance between these things, but they're also just kind of fundamentally opposed to each other. They're just separate, different parts of his life, which I think is an interesting way to think about it. And I'm curious, what students make of that. Okay, the last part I'm going to take us to for now is on that very last page on 39. Just the last little stretch here. So the nearby river was flooding, water was creeping up the street, and they needed help sandbagging right now. I said okay, hung up, and apologized to everyone at the table. The food was just arriving. I said okay. I said sorry, but I have to go. And when I stood to leave, they said, "Don't worry about it. It's all right." They said they understood. And I guess the question I have here is, do they understand? Will they ever understand? And why Moore chooses to end at this point in this essay called Education, about kind of straddling these worlds and operating both of them and operating different ones and so on and so forth. I think Moore, in some sense, communicates a sense that we never fully understand each other. But maybe we do understand enough. right? Or maybe that's the point of having these kind of interactions, of having an essay like this, right? Is to help people understand to the extent that they can understand. And maybe that's the essence of education itself, right? Is that I don't expect any given student is going to pick up every single thing that I try to communicate across over the course of a semester, but maybe I communicate enough that I feel that you understand what I was trying to do, or your own understanding maybe is more important than the understanding I was trying to impose on you. So anyway, I think there's a lot embedded in here, and again, like all of these essays, I'm barely scratching the surface, but I'd love to hear thoughts on any of the questions that I've raised, the individual passages I've led you to, but also, as always, any other parts of this essay that drew your attention, were of interest to you, questions that came up, anything along those lines. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. So again, please feel free to weigh in with questions. Contact me individually if you have any individual questions. But otherwise, we'll have a discussion of education below, as well as our discussion of our flash pieces for this time. But thanks everyone, and I will catch you next time.